we've evolved around and in the context of having radiation around us. So guess what? Ionizing radiation by itself is not unsurvivable. In fact, it's something that our bodies have repair mechanisms for. We're expecting a certain amount of it. The issue with all things in life is what happens if you get too much? So we're going to break the types of radiation down into its two principal components, right? So there are particles that we have to worry about, and then there's electromagnetic radiation, which is photons, which is like X-rays, gamma rays, things like that. So let's start here. Alpha particles are these big giant things which are ejected from the nucleus, and they consist of 2 protons, 2 neutrons. It's parts of the core of the atom, the nucleus. Man, these are giant, big honking things. They got a charge on them. So guess what? Alpha particles positively charged here and made up, like I said, of these 2 protons, 2 neutrons, and from the atom's nucleus, they decay from the decay of the heaviest radioactive elements, such as uranium, radium, and polonium. Remember that polonium-210 stuff? We'll talk about that in a minute. So, hey, guess what? These alpha particles, they don't even penetrate skin. Right? They're really big, giant, lumbery things. They're stopped by a sheet of paper. That's the good news. Bad news, if you get them inside of you, like if you got that polonium-210, if you ingested it, well, now it doesn't have to travel all that far because those big, heavy particles are inside, right next to your cells, where they can do a ton of damage. These things are like dump trucks lumbering through a party or something like that. So alpha particles, good news, easy to stop. Bad news, get them inside. They do a huge amount of damage. Beta particles, these are electrons. Fast, they're just ejected electrons. They're moving really, really fast. These are emitted by things like hydrogen-3, which is tritium, carbon-14, strontium-90. So these can penetrate a little bit more as well. They're also charged. They have a negative charge. So again, they get stopped relatively easily by things. Those charges actually slow them down because they bump into things and get stuck, as it were. So they say here, these can be stopped by a layer of clothing or a thin layer of substance such as aluminum. Some beta particles are higher energy. They're just moving faster, and they can actually penetrate a little bit deeper. But again, these, like alpha particles, do their worst damage when they're ingested, because now they're inside the body and they don't have to do any penetrating. They're next to your cells where they can do massive damage. And then the fast thing would be neutrons. Fast neutrons, I should have written slow neutrons down here, but ejected neutrons, these get ejected typically very, very early on in a nuclear explosion or in a nuclear reaction, a fission reaction. They burst and then they're gone. So these aren't things that generally you're going to run into except at the moment of ignition of a nuclear reaction when it actually happens. Typically, I mean, there's ways you could, but you probably have to work at a nuclear center and handle some really exotic materials to encounter them. So how do we make sense of a chart like this, right? So this actually comes from a website. You can go and you can plug in any city, any sort of atmospheric conditions, and any sort of megaton bombs. Now, 10 megaton bomb, that's a big one. That's a monster. That's massively larger than the one that got dropped in Hiroshima or Nagasaki. So this is a pretty bad event right here. And then I set the conditions to say, well, what if it sort of blew towards my house? How much trouble would I be in? And the answer is a lot more trouble than I'd want to be in. But we're going to go back to the rule of sevens. Here's another rule of 7. With fallout, because of the nature of the atomic explosion, it creates very many highly energized, very unstable radionuclides, which are radioactive elements, right? And they decay very, very quickly. So if you had 1,000 units of radioactivity, and we'll talk about what a rad and a rem is in just a second. If you had 1,000 units of these after 1 hour, after 2 hours, you'd only have 480. So you can see we've lost just slightly more than half of the total radioactive power of this in just 1 hour. And then after 7 hours, we're down by a factor of 10. So with fallout, you get a 10-fold decrease every 7 hours. So after 48 hours, so we've been through several series. We've been through 7 series of 7 here. So 7 times 7 is 49. So after 48 hours, we're saying here, our 1,000 units of radioactivity has shrunk all the way down to 10. It's the good news. Okay, so what does that mean for us? All right, well, let's talk about this. So with radiation, so here's maybe on top, we see alpha particles and beta. They get stopped way out on the surface, but these gammas, they penetrate a lot more deeply here. what do you do? This is an old fallout shelter from the 50s or 40s or whenever. 50s, I guess it would have had to have been, because the bombs were just being developed in the 40s. Anyway, what do they show you there? There's a lot of shielding around this. These people are underground. They have an air filter. That's to keep the contamination out. I'm going to talk about that, what that means, because that is a big deal. They got water down there and plumbing. They've got a periscope, I guess, to see what's going on. They got a burning house up top there. All that's shredded. Food, water, batteries, emergency oxygen, Geiger counter. So that's what a 1950-style bomb shelter would have looked like. Pretty good idea. Now, very few people actually have access to anything like that these days. So instead, what would we look at? Well, here in the red, we can see that if you could pick a place that's down in your basement, you want distance. So if that fallout's landed on the roof of your house, you want to be as far away from the roof as possible because distance is your friend. Time is your friend. So you're going to try and get as far away as you can. So here we see that on this, they've got a little earth ramped up here. So that's why they want to be over on this side of things. Even if there is radioactivity that's landed here, it's going to have to come through all of this material to get to them. So you want to be as far away. So if you're in your house and there's a fallout event, whether this is from a nuclear plant that's given up the ghost or, melted down or something happened, or if there is a nuclear exchange of some kind, you want to be, if you can, if you have one, in the basement, in the center, and as far away from things as possible. And if you had a Geiger counter or a dosimeter or some way of reading radioactivity, you would be able to tell, even within that context, which is the safest place to be in, possibly, if your machine could tell you something like that. Just as good, is here is an interior room if you do not have a basement. And as well, if you could put up things like books and furniture against a wall, it would create a little bit of separation from anything coming from this side. And as well, this zone here, because these rays are going to either have to penetrate all the way down or they have to try and penetrate through from the side. So this is a little safe zone down here. And of course, here they actually have a shelter. So they've got some concrete all around or some material like that. They say here that if you have a one-story house, you get 90 to 95% protection. 90 to 95% protection if you can go down to the basement. If you have a two-story house, that goes up to 95 or even higher percent protection. So it's actually fairly protective, believe it or not, to be just simply down in the basement, away from the walls, and follow some of these basic rules here. Pile up stuff. You want stuff between you and whatever's going on out there in the world. And you just need it for how long? Not as long as you might think. Within 7 hours, we've got 10-fold less radioactivity. After just 7 days, we're all the way down to just 1/100th of the original dose, right? So, but obviously the first 14 hours is actually, that's your most, you're going to get most of the decay right there. So even if you're in something really bad like this, we're at 1,000 rads per hour, that's bad. If you're outside, you're toast, okay? Absolutely no question about it. One thing I didn't point, I showed houses. What if you're in a city? There you actually have even more protection because you can get to the center of a tall building and you could be up 10 stories and still 10 stories from the top. You'd actually be in really good shape there. You want to be away from the ground where all that radiation might have settled, and also on the roof, and then staying away from the porch or any other exterior place where some of that radioactivity and the fallout could have settled. So it's just distance. Just think through, if you ever get caught in a situation like this, it's just how far away can you be from a surface outside. Obviously, you don't want windows open. You don't want any of this stuff blowing in, because we're going to talk about contamination. That's actually the worst part of this story, more than the radiation. How do those relate? We'll get there in just a second. You just wait it out as long as possible. If you can't wait it out, you're going to have to suit up as best as possible. So you don't breathe it in. You get a full face mask, good P100 filters. You don't want even the tiniest particles coming in. So you've all heard of N95s. We're going for the P100s here. They're canister masks and like that, and they do a much better job of blocking out those even really ultrafine tiny particles. You want none of this stuff inside your body. If you do go outside, you got to wear clothes or Tyvek suits that you can take off, leave outside, maybe rinse or hose off before re-entering if possible, if there's any way to have a hose system there with a sprayer on it. And just make sure you knock all that stuff down and just you're not bringing it in the house. And then if you had a Geiger counter or equivalent somewhere right near there, you could check and see if you have any hot spots on you. And because if you do, it might be a little piece that you missed. Use the tape, get it off, get it out of there. As well, any areas that are really essential, like your garden, that you don't want to be contaminated. So this is the problem after the Chernobyl incident, and it torched off and all this fallout came and it landed all over people's soils. Those soils are contaminated often for decades. It takes a really long time, even though a lot of the radiation and radioactivity burns away quickly. There's a long residual tail of stuff, and you really don't want to be eating plants that have been grown in soil that's contaminated. So the way you avoid that is you would cover up gardens and do things like that where, as much as you could, plastic goes over your essential areas. Avoiding contamination, though, that's the most essential and a lot more difficult to do over time. That's the harder part of this story. Because the little tiny particles could be anywhere. So that's the tricky part. So you're going to, some basic things, just get some basic things, really helpful. You're going to want plastic sheeting to, cover, make clean rooms, create a separate portico if you are going in and out, so you have a clean room in and out of the house, things like that. Tape off windows if you have any leaky sort of doors that aren't all that well sealed, you're going to want to seal them. Things like that. You're going to need full face mask respirators, full face. Potassium iodide tablets, and that's for the I-125, which is a gaseous emission. It's in the air, and that you absorb that, and it goes, your thyroid loves seeing iodine, so boom, it just pulls it in. The potassium iodide simply prevents your thyroid from taking up that iodine because your body's already flooded with iodine. So that's the purpose of those tablets. They don't protect you from radiation. They just prevent your thyroid from accumulating it because it's like, oh, iodine. I love this stuff. And so that's, it just outcompetes that with the potassium iodide. Water and food inside your home, easily accessible, so you don't have to go somewhere else. And don't think your water is going to keep working if you're on city water in an event like this, or even that it's safe. So you're going to want, as soon as you hear about an event of some kind, you're going to want to store or have stored a lot of fresh water, enough for at least 7 days, by the way I've put this out there. And then dosimeters, absolutely important, so you have data in terms of what you're facing and how hot the situation still really is. Hey, that's all I have for you today here, and sorry for the somber subject. It is something I have been talking about for a while, and just sorry we're talking about it again. It's just after everything, after the COVID failures, to be facing this level of failure right on its heels is getting cranky about the whole thing. That's putting it mildly. All right. Hey, I hope to see you over there at peakprosperity.com. Come on by. We're having great conversations. We'll see the rest of you next week. Everybody else, see you over there. Bye.